So we are continuing with our discussion of church history, and tonight we're going to try to cover a lot of ground chronologically, and some of these issues we'll be talking about we'll cover a lot of ground, and we'll come back and look at the other issue, pretty much cover that same amount of ground, time frame, and so forth. But we're going to start moving along a little bit quicker chronologically than we have to get us, hopefully in a couple weeks, up to the Reformation, when we'll slow down a little bit more and need to discuss that in a little bit more detail. So what we're going to start with tonight is the papacy. And the papacy coming from the idea of pope. The word pope means papa. So that's where you get papacy from. It's a discussion of the title which they hold. It's a title for bishops, historically speaking. It spoke of the fatherly care of the bishops who were the leaders in a certain city of the churches. So it spoke of the fatherly care of the bishops over their flocks. And so Papa, father, you see where we get this from. And up until really about the 6th century, it was used for bishops in general. And it was only about that time that it began to be reserved for the bishops of Rome that would come along. And we're going to see how that kind of develops. And that's really what I want to do here. I want to kind of take us through a general development of the papacy, how it came about. So not a lot of details, because there's a lot of details here that we could look at, but just sort of in a general way how this developed, just to get a flavor for what went on with this. And the argument, what it came to be, was that Jesus basically gave Peter the authority over the entire church. So Matthew chapter 16, if you read that chapter, you could read it in that way if you wanted to. I don't think that's the right way to read it, but that's the way the argument developed and began to look at that for its support. And it was came to be viewed that the Bishop of Rome was the successor to Peter. So in their view, Jesus, this simplified version of it, but Jesus gave Peter the authority, and he became the Bishop of Rome, and then he passed that authority down to the next Bishop of Rome, down to what we've got now. And so that, in general, is how the idea of the Pope came about, the papacy. But let's look at it in a little bit more detail about how it evolved, how it developed. During the 2nd century, so we'll go way back to the 2nd century, there were, it's the bishops of Rome. Because what happened is, what we believe happened is, historically speaking, is that power became more centralized over time. So I think originally in the New Testament, what you had were elders, pastors of churches, local churches. So you would have a variety of them and a plurality of them. And of course, in a larger city, you would have a number of churches meeting. It wouldn't just be one church, but there was close relationship between the churches. And so it developed because of the heresies that were coming into existence. One of the ways to combat that was to have centralized authority. And so I think what happened is that there was a central authority, one man who sort of rose to the top, who was the leader of leaders among the churches in a certain city, and he became the bishop over all of the churches. He became the authority over all of the local churches. And so this developed over time in that way. And they became known as bishops over a certain geographical location, all the churches that were there. Well, the bishops of Rome in the 2nd century, a number of them, and we'll talk about why this was the case, but the churches and leaders in the churches across the empire really began to look to them, ask them questions about the heresies that were in existence, get their advice, how to handle this, what about this teaching, and so forth. So you can see how this could come about. So let me just mention a few of them. The names aren't really important because you can look them up in history books and online, that kind of thing. But again, this is just not to give you the names and dates and details and all that. That's not what I'm interested in right now. It's just to show you the flavor of how this developed. So there was one bishop named Victor, late 100s. He exerted a lot of influence in regard to fixing a common date for Easter. There was a lot of debate going on in the church about, okay, when is Easter exactly? When should we celebrate it? That kind of thing. And so he had a lot of influence in regard to that. So why is that? Well, it's only important in the sense of, for us, that it was showing his influence. Okay, so Bishop of Rome, very early on, late 100s, is showing some kind of influence to the church at large. But, nothing more than that. This wasn't a full-blown pope at this point like we've got today and later in church history. Stephen the First, as he's called, mid-200s, was the first bishop to claim primacy. Well, what does that mean? Well, he claimed that the Bishop of Rome had primacy over all the other bishops in the empire, at least in writing. He's the first one we can go back to at this point. We can look back in the historical writings and find that in his writing, he's saying, hey, I've got, as Bishop of Rome, I've basically got authority over everybody else. I've got some sort of primacy over everybody else. Damsus the First, the mid to late 300s, where this takes us to, contended against the heresies of Arianism and Apollinarianism. He presided over 2 Roman synods in 368 and 369. He sent his representatives to the Council of Constantinople in 381. He also commissioned a Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible. Jerome was his secretary. He was the translator of the Vulgate. And Jerome agreed with the designation that Damsus was the apostolic see. That he was first to use that title, which was just an important title, is all we need to know. And so he used that of himself. He also built a marble monument in honor of Peter and Paul. So in other words, he's exerting a lot of influence. He's got a lot of influence going on at this point. So this is the mid to late 300s. Also the late 300s, there was another man who was the Bishop of Rome, who was the first to use the term Pope for himself in regard to being the Bishop of Rome. He was the first to issue a decree, which was a binding legal precedent at this time on disputes in the church. So in other words, he's saying, okay, we got these disputes here, these controversies. I can legally declare what is right and what is wrong in these disputes. Innocent I, in the early 400s, advanced the idea of the supremacy of the Pope by introducing the concept of primacy of jurisdiction. So he's saying that, okay, Bishop of Rome, in essence what he's saying, has jurisdiction, primacy of jurisdiction over everybody else. There was consultation between the Bishop of Rome and outlying bishops going back to an early period of the church history. So what I'm showing to you is that there is a development in this idea of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. He has authority over everybody, so there's a development to this. And that's important to understand. There's a development. It's not like this is full-blown at the beginning. And it's not like it's even to the point that we're going to see as I go further with this, that later on in church history These are clearly popes, okay, popes in the way that we understand them today, and have all of this authority. He's the head of the church, Roman Catholic Church, all this kind of stuff. Well, it wasn't there early on in the history of the church. Something that developed over time, over a long period of time, and slowly these different blocks were added to the construction of this. Well, why did it develop with Rome? And you can see the biblical theological reasons why they use. I've already mentioned that. But also it had something to do with Rome itself. Okay, Rome was the political center of the Roman Empire, obviously. Well, it also became the ecclesiastical center of the empire. And so the Roman bishop, obviously, since he's over this church, he carries with him considerable influence. Also, the Church of Rome was believed to be the wealthiest of the churches in the early history of the church. Probably, again, it's the development of the Roman Empire being the center of the Roman Empire itself. So this internal development of the Roman Church, Church of Rome, also was because of Rome's importance itself. So the church grew in numbers and significance. Bruce Shelley, who wrote the book that I'm recommending, says that by the middle of the 3rd century, its membership probably approached 30,000. It's a massive church. It's a mega church of that day. It counted 150 clerics, he says, and 1,500 widows and poor people that they would take care of. So this is a massive church, a wealthy church that existed. So that's early on, and so you can see why the foundation is laid for the way it is for the further development of the papacy. So let me go along with this a little bit further in our church history. Leo I, also called Leo the Great, the early 400s to mid 400s, he really brought prestige to the office of the Bishop of Rome. He's been called the master builder of the papacy. So we really begin to see a strong foundation for the papacy being built with Leo I. He's considered by many to be the first pope in the more modern sense of the term. He's the one that put the primacy of jurisdiction in full practice. Okay, he really fleshed the theory out at this point. He took upon himself the title of chief priest, which had been used by the Roman emperors up to this point in reference to the state religion. So you can see the power that's really coming to play here with him. He was important for a number of reasons. He defended Rome against the barbarians. He negotiated with Attila the Hun to not come in and destroy Rome, which was a big deal obviously in 452. In 455, he saved the city from being burned by the Vandals. So he was very influential. He was also very influential in regard to his teaching on the person of Christ. And some very important teaching regarding Christ that was extremely influential throughout the church. And he also argued for the papacy coming from Peter. So he made some pretty strong arguments for the papacy being passed down from Peter. So again, that takes us to the early to mid 400s. You see it really beginning to take shape in a strong way, this idea of the papacy. In 445, the emperor of the empire said that the Bishop of Rome was the law for all. So now, not only do you have it within the church, these bishops of Rome arguing that they have primacy over everybody else. Now you've got the emperor saying, yeah, they're right. The Bishop of Rome is right. He's got power. In 451, Pope Leo convened the important Council of Chalcedon. And what's important about that? Well, or Chalcedon is pronounced two different ways. What's important about that? Well, typically up to that point, it was the emperors who called the councils together. Remember with Constantine, he was the one who called the Nicene Council together. But now you have the Pope, or the Bishop of Rome, calling this very important church council together, which is normally what the emperors would do. So by the 5th century, it was generally acknowledged that the Bishop of Rome was primary among the bishops, and even when a bishop in another city was deposed by a local council, that is, they had a concern with him being a heretic or whatever, teaching falsely, the other bishops could call a council together, bring him forward and charge him and this kind of thing. Well, he could appeal to the Bishop of Rome over those other bishops. So you can see that this has really begun to develop with the Bishop of Rome having authority. The late 400s, Gelasius I, Bishop of Rome, claimed the power of the Pope held sway over even the emperor whenever these two came into conflict. So exerting even more power at this point. And he was the first to take the title Vicar of Christ. You may have heard that in regard to the Pope, who it means is the earthly representative of Christ. In the late 500s, the early 600s, Gregory I was also called Gregory the Great. He was the second to have the title. Leo was the first one. He's the second, the Great. And very influential. We don't have time to give him the attention that he really deserves, because he had a lot of influence. The Gregorian chant, you've heard of that, what comes from him. There's other things as well. Had tremendous influence. And again, solidifies the power of the Bishop of Rome. Leo III in the late 700s to early 800s, and we're going to see this a little bit more detail when we get to it, but he crowned Charlemagne as emperor on Christmas Day 800. So here you have the Bishop of Rome crowning the emperor. So shows you where the power lies, right? They have the power to make and break emperors by this point. So tremendous power by this point. But, and I'm going to go ahead and quickly take us through the rest of the history, almost to the Reformation, just so we'll get a flavor for the papacy as it goes along. It wasn't always that they held all this power and everything was wonderful with the papacy. They had problems along the way as well. In the 9th and 10th centuries, there was a major decline in the power and the stability of the papacy. Don't have time to go into a lot of details. But in the 58 years between 897 and 955, there were 17 popes. And it wasn't just that they were dying off. There was a lot of corruption in the church, in the papacy at this time. Just a lot of it. There was a lot of breach of clerical celibacy. Remember the priests and popes had to be celibate? Well, not so much during this time period. Some of them actually married, but most of them just took concubines. So there was a lot of corruption going on at this point. And this instability, this corruption that existed only began to wane due to a revival that took place in 910 at Cluny. And it was really a reform within monasticism. When we talk about monasticism was a powerful movement. Well, like so many movements and institutions, after a while they become corrupt. And the church as well does. And the professing church. And so that happened with monasticism. There was a revival about 910. And while it was within monasticism, it affected the whole church. And so it affected the papacy as well, the way that the papacy was viewed and carried out. Well, moving along a little bit further, 1046, Henry III of Germany, travel to Rome in order to be crowned as the new emperor. And he gets there and he finds out that there's actually 3 popes at the time. There are 3 rivals for the title of pope. They all claim to be the rightfully elected pope. So he gets there and he tries to sort out the matter. Okay, who's the right pope here? Because remember, this is supposed to be passed down to the successor, not the 3 of them. And so one of these is right, or none of them are right, or whatever. So he's trying to figure it all out. Can't get it figured out. And finally he said, well, none of you are the pope. And he put his cousin in as the papist, as the new pope. And Leo IX is what he became known as. And he began to try to reform the church at this point. Gregory VII, also known as Hildebrand, this is from about 1073 to 1085 to give you the time frame of where we're at. He demanded that all the priests be celibate. Again, they're trying to reform the church in the way that they thought it should be reformed. And he was also involved historically in what is known as the famous investiture struggle, and which involved really a conflict between the church and the state. And we perhaps, if we have time, we'll look at this maybe next time in a little bit of detail, just so you know what's going on there. But it ended. Henry IV was involved with this, the king at this time, and it all ended with Henry IV standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days until the Pope would forgive him. So again, showing the power of the Pope even over emperors and kings. Innocent III, about 1198 to 1216, represents the zenith of papal power. At his inauguration, Innocent quoted Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 10 in reference to himself. And the verse says, "See, today I appoint you over nations." He said, well, that's referring to me, Bishop of Rome. Incredible desire for power among these men. And he also taught that the Pope stands between God and man as a mediator between God and man, as the vicar of Christ. It was during his time that there was a church council that developed the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the belief, the Roman Catholic belief, that in the elements of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, that those are actually transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ. So again, when Roman Catholicism argues for their historical existence as a church with all of their doctrines, you need to understand that many of these doctrines did not come about till much, much later. And so this is early 1200s when this doctrine is developed. Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303, was known to wear imperial robes and richly jeweled crown and cry out, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." He taught that the Pope held both the temporary and the spiritual swords, meaning that he has ultimate authority in both realms. And then at this point, when Boniface is 86 years old, King Philip tried to get rid of him because of the immorality which existed among the papacy, and he actually sent troops who broke into the Pope's bedroom when he's on vacation and kept him prisoner for 3 days, but the people would then released him, but because he was so old, he died within a few weeks. The Pope did. But the important thing about that is that here is a king who is exerting authority over the Pope at this point. And historians have pointed out that what makes this significant is that it marks the first open rejection of papal spiritual dominance. And the quote is, by the rising national monarchies of the West. So Stephen Osment, in his book, The Age of Reform, says the papal, and it's going to kind of sum up the papacy for us right now, before we come back to it at the Reformation. He says, the papal monarchy of the 12th and 13th centuries, whose ideals died hard, was no match for the new political monarchies of the 14th and 15th centuries. Papal excommunication and interdict ceased to be effective ways to implement the Church's will. Indeed, their exercise encouraged a new kind of spiritual identity, nationalism. So this is a very important development at this point. I mean, we think that the nations like we have them now are nation states, as they're called. It's always existed, and it's not. It's a modern thing that we have, and the way that we have it. And so what this historian is pointing back to is this time now. There's a shift at this point in 14th, 15th centuries, that time frame, where the spirituality and that authority that existed with the papacy now gives way, as he calls it, to a new kind of spiritual identity, nationalism, which we live with to this day. And one could argue this is one of the reasons why we have many of the wars that we do. You thought, well, religion causes wars. Well, religion does cause wars, and even the religion of nationalism causes war. This is one of the primary reasons why we have World War II, to kill so many millions and millions of people. One of the reasons why we have wars today, like we do. It's because of, in some measure, it is because of the religion of nationalism. So that can be a very dangerous religion. So anyhow, that's kind of a summation of a quick overview of the papacy as it developed. Now, let's go back in time and come back with another theme, and that is the spread of Islam. Let me give you a couple of quotes, because they say so much better than I could regarding the situation in regard to the Arab world and development of Islam. These historians say by the start of the 7th century, that's your time frame, the start of the 7th century, the apparently unchanging course of Arab history, so everything's just going along, nothing's happening with Arab history to speak of. They say the apparently unchanging course of Arab history was deflected by two unforeseen developments. So these are two things. One, the climate of the Arabian Peninsula became even drier than it had been. So global warming, right? Okay. So they have global warming back in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula. And two, the population rapidly increased. Suddenly, they say, the Arabs found they had to seize more land on which to graze their herds. An aggressive Ethiopian state in Africa blocked expansion to the south. But to the north lay the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, both of which were weakened by their centuries of war with each other. Okay, so what they're saying is they couldn't go south because there's an empire that's stronger than they are. So where do they go? Well, they look north. And there's a massive empire to their north. But it's been weakened because of the wars of fighting within the empire over time. They also go on and point out that the religion that Muhammad founded, which is Islam, became known as Islam, gave the Arabs the unity they needed. Islam forged an empire by combining religion and government in a way that attracted the unquestioning loyalty of a vigorous and warlike people. Now, to start with, his teaching, Muhammad's teaching, wasn't very popular. It wasn't like it spread like wildfire. Everybody said, "Oh, this is wonderful. This should be a new world religion." It was not accepted by many. In 622, his enemies actually forced him to flee for his life from Mecca to Yathrib. And this is the event by which Muslims date their calendar, his having to flee in 622. In Yathrib, Muhammad was more successful than he was in Mecca. Many people accepted his teaching, and he actually, so many people did that he renamed the city Medina, the city of the prophet. And he organized a government. He organized a fanatical army to follow him. And by 630, it's just 8 years later, his army had conquered so much of the Arabian Peninsula that he was able to return to Mecca, capture it, and force his opponents to adopt Islam. But then 2 years later, he died. Muhammad died. But the movement obviously continued. We know that down to the day. In 640, the Muslim armies ransacked Egypt. And in a sad occurrence of what happened, Alexandria is in Egypt. We talked about Alexandria, massive Christian city, a center of learning for Christianity, had a massive library there. Well, many of the Greek scholars that were residing there had to leave and go to Constantinople. And we'll learn more about Constantinople later and what happened with it. But Constantinople is the capital of the Byzantine Empire at this point. Well, in 641, an Arab commander gave an order that the Alexandrian library be burnt to the ground. And again, it's a massive library. The population, the people who populated the city at that point protested, and they made such energetic protests that the commander went to the local Arab leader and said, "What do you think about this? Do we burn the books or not?" He said, "Burn the books." And so the books, the report goes from history that the books were placed in the public baths in the city and burned, and it took 6 months to burn them all. So very, very sad situation for the culture of that day in that place. But who knows? You know, they burned a lot of them, whether they got them all or not, I don't know. But essentially, all of them destroyed the library there. But we need to understand that something here. I mean, people look at that and say, well, this is the way that the Muslims are. This is the way they were, and this is the way they are. But to take that one event and then transpose it to them would be a mistake, because I'm going to show you some things in just a minute about this. But let me say right now that normally they respected the Greek teaching that was predominant in that part of the world of that day. So they were the Muslims were actually very influential in regard to their learning. They weren't stupid people. They weren't ignorant. They were advanced civilization. They developed an advanced civilization, and they would turn around and influence Europe in tremendous ways with their learning. And maybe we can flesh this out a little bit more as we move along. But just as an example, they actually introduced the math system that we have today into Europe, which really came from India through them. And so the base 10 decimal system, positional notation, the number 0, negative numbers were all introduced. Before, what was used? Well, the Greek and Roman systems, right? So you think about it, we do sometimes, but normally we don't use the Roman numeral system, do we? I mean, we make use of it for outlines and that kind of thing. But that's what was in use at the time. What kind of number system do we use? What do we call it? Arabic numbers, right? Arabic numbers. Arabic? What was that? Well, it came from the Arabs. So this very interesting thing. Let me carry on with the survey here, and then we'll come back and talk about their influence a little bit more. In the middle of the 7th century, there was sort of a hereditary monarchy set up among them, which ruled Islam for almost a century. The capital was in Damascus in Syria, and they set out to expand Islam in all directions. In North Africa, their armies marched, would have been westward into Egypt. They captured Byzantine provinces as they went, because remember, the Byzantine Empire is all over the place, that part of the world at this time, where they're taking over those provinces. In 711, AD 711, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. Now they're going into Europe. By 721, they had conquered the kingdom that existed in Spain. They went to the mountains of Pyrenees, the Pyrenees Mountains. I assume that's how you pronounce it, not sure. But that's the border of Spain and France, basically. So you got the Frankish monarchy, which existed over there. So they're up to the edge of that. They actually cross the mountains. They're coming into Europe. They begin to march across the Frankish kingdom, and they're finally defeated at the Battle of Tours in 733 by Charles Martel. So it's only this issue, this defeat now, as they're trying to get into Europe. There is a revolt back in North Africa at the same time, but this is what prevents them from going further into Europe. They're stopped at that point, or they probably would have taken over much of Europe, and the history of Europe would have looked a whole lot different than it does to us now. In the meantime, Islamic forces moved east from Persia. They conquered lands occupied by the Turks, by Chinese, by Indians, by the Tibetans. By the 8th century, Islam stretched from the Pyrenees to the Himalayas. Massive empire. But again, we got corruption that sets in among the leadership of this movement. And there's a great revolution that takes place, and the leaders of the revolution are called Abbasids, because they claim to be descendants from an uncle of Muhammad named Abbas. And they massacre all of the other leaders at this point, except for one who escapes to Spain. And so now this Abbasid dynasty ruled for the next 5 centuries. And their new capital was in Baghdad, far to the east of the original center of power. So in other words, there's a shift away from the Middle East, and they're not oriented toward the Middle East at this time in history. And the threat to Europe is now removed in large measure for a time. But they've got this huge empire which they cannot govern in an effective way, and so it broke up into a number of different provinces in the late 8th century. But what about their influence? Well, again, they're a tremendous influence. They're quite a civilization. Literature flourished during this time period. The famous 1001 Nights is only one of many great Arabic literary achievements. They also had historians. There's one of whom, al-Musadi, who died in 956, wrote a comprehensive history of the world in 30 volumes. Arabic theologians created a large body of religious literature. The Hellenistic learning of ancient Greek was introduced to Islam during the Abbasid dynasty. Some of the principal Greek schools were taken over by the Arab conquerors. Whole regiments of scholars at Baghdad devoted their lives to translate the classical Greek writings into Arabic. They had huge libraries where they collected books in Greek, Arabic, and the languages of India and China. The scholar Al-Kinki wrote an estimated, 265 volumes in an attempt to unite Greek and Arab philosophy and that learning into a single body of knowledge. You want to bring it all together. And at this time in history, they were ahead of their contemporary Christian scholars in regard to science and mathematics. So what we need to understand is we need to be careful about reading into different civilizations and cultures certain things in regard to one thing, just total ignorance and a certain mindset. And I say that because I think the popular view of Islam, of the Muslims, even today, in some quarters, is that all they want to do is run around and chop off people's heads. They're just a bunch of ignorant people who want to destroy cultures and civilizations and kill people. And obviously, there's some that are like that. I mean, we're seeing that very clearly, that there are some that are like. But by and large, that's not the Muslim culture. And I'm not being an apologist for Islam by any means. But I think an honest view of history and of their culture will show you something different, that they are an intelligent people. Just like other peoples of the world are intelligent. And they have developed a civilization. And they have technology. And they have the wisdom and knowledge to be able to do these things. And we see this in history. So we need to understand and appreciate at that level that we do, without accepting, saying, okay, we accept your view of religion and your worldview and these kind of things, but we just need to understand who they are and what they have been in history. And hopefully the way they develop will show this. Again, it's not saying that they weren't a warlike people, that they didn't produce atrocities. They certainly did, and we're going to see when we get to the Crusades. Won't be able to do it tonight, but when we get to the Crusades, we'll see that there were atrocities on both sides of this, which is what war so often does. But one of the things that had happened, and I'm just going to kind of sum this up in regard to Islam, the European people, the Germanic peoples at this time, which were very influential, had all but wiped out the trade of the regions of Europe whenever they came in and conquered a land. They came in and did great devastation to the land. In contrast to them, the Arabs at this time would go in and conquer a land, and they preserved, at least at first, they were preserving the commerce and the economy of the vast territories that existed. And all of those were absorbed into Islam. So this is one reason why they're expanding and becoming so powerful, and the European empire is weakening because of what the European empire is doing to themselves. So all of this is going on at the same time, and that explains historically why Islam spreads like it does, and Europe becomes in danger of being conquered by Islam. Because there's no trade going on between the Arab nations, the Arab kingdom, and Europe, because of what's going on in Europe, no vast trade, that opened up, they had to find places to trade with. So the Far East is where they head to, and they opened up new trade routes going there. And the Islamic, the Arab ships dominate the Mediterranean at this time. And because of this, the Muslims become very advanced navigators for their time. They make use of the compass, the astrolabe, which they imported from China. And they make the first long voyages of this time period out of sight of land. They go where they can't see land anymore. And they developed a number of other things that helped them to sail in this way. They defeated the Byzantine fleet in 655, and so as it is said, the Mediterranean became a Muslim lake at this time. The trade of Islam rapidly increased, and the Arabic products become demanded and recognized as excellent throughout the world at this time. By the end of the 10th century, Islam had broken up into 3 caliphates, and they never regained that political unity which they had at that point. Even down to today, it's a broken empire, if you will. And so they continue to fight among themselves. Once the political power of the empire declined, it became difficult for them to expand. It became difficult to continue to produce their trade and get their commerce. And the distrust between the Christians and the Muslims made any other kind of trade routes into Europe all but impossible. And so the Arabic commerce and industry stopped growing at this point. And we're going to see, again, Lord willing, as we move forward, how this began to develop in the form of clashes that would take place through the Crusades, which lasted a number of years as well. Okay, so we better stop there for tonight. Got just a couple minutes if anybody has a question. Okay.
I know they burned down the library, but what were they doing?
Yeah, so the question is, in regard to the burning of the books, burn down the library, and all of that kind of stuff, what was their thinking at the time? Were they wanting to just get rid of Christianity and the influence of it, or what was their motivation? I'm not sure. I'm not sure in that particular situation what the motivation were. A lot of times there's complex reasons. It's not just a matter of, okay, we want to get rid of this stuff. But probably it had something, my guess is, my educated guess is that it had something to do with Christianity and the empire of Christianity coming out of Europe that had taken over that region. And so they wanted to get rid of it. And I think, again, I can't speak specifically to that situation, but when we come to modern times and you got the same kind of mindset sometimes among some of the Muslims where they're going in and destroying whole civilizations and all the artifacts. You're hearing these sad stories of taking place in Syria right now and other places where they're destroying whole, churches that are 1,000 years old, buildings and libraries and things like this, artifacts that you're not going to be able to recover. They're just destroyed from ancient history. They're destroying these things. And the mindset seems to be that these things are being lifted up in an idolatrous way. And so you need to get rid of any form of idolatry. And so they're destroying all those things. I don't know if that's what was happening there, but my guess is it was something to do with that influence. It was against the Muslim teaching, and so they wanted to get rid of it. And I think it was probably some radicals in that area who'd taken it over for whatever reasons they wanted to do it, because you don't see them doing that everywhere. It wasn't wholesale. And that's one thing I think we've got to keep in mind is the complexity of people and movements and cultures. And we see it within our circles as well. There's this complexity. There's some people who are very dogmatic about this and very fanatical and they want to get rid, and others that are more, no, we don't need to take that route. And I think even from the historical account there, we can see that taking place. We weren't sure that they wanted to do this, but yeah, let's go ahead and do it. And they did it. So that's the best answer I can give with the knowledge I have of it. But it would just seem to make sense that Yeah, this is something they didn't want. These books were something against what they believed, so they were going to get rid of them. Yeah. So probably a lot of history disappeared that day, never to be recovered. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks for your attention. Let me dismiss this real quick. Our Father, as we go from here, may you be pleased to protect us and use us for your kingdom purposes. Help us to take what we have learned here tonight, the beauty of the gospel contrasted with the corruption of humanity that we've seen throughout history. Help us to live out the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, that we might see people come to Christ and whole countries and civilizations be transformed by the influence of Christ. We pray this through Christ's name. Amen.